Welcome to Stoic Conversations. My name is Michael Tremblay.
I'm Caleb Ontiveros.
And today we are talking about the New Testament. So I wanted to do this episode because we chatted about this a bit in our New Year's episode. I've read parts of the New Testament this year, and they were quite impactful. Really enjoyed it. I'm not a religious person. I've never studied Christianity in any sort of focused capacity, but really enjoyed reading it as a historical piece and as a philosophical piece. And in this episode, I wanted to focus specifically on the Gospel of Matthew. And the reason for that, for those that don't know, the New Testament is broken up into it opens with these stories of the life of Jesus Christ from four of his apostles, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And this is really the biography, the kind of the birth of Jesus, what he taught, and then his death and resurrection. And I think it's a great, if you're only going to read one part, you kind of get a big piece of the story there. And so I thought it was the other reason that I wanted to talk about that is it also goes right into, what Jesus said. It's supposed to be this kind of firsthand account of his lessons, anecdotes or examples of things that he did or people he helped or arguments that he made. And so it's a great insight into Christianity. If we focus on it as as the following of Christ and his teachings, we get lots of examples of Jesus doing things and saying things in these books. Another thing that I wanted to preface with this is that my approach is going to be primarily philosophical. So I'm interested in the thinking of Jesus Christ as a thinker, as an ethical thinker. And what was really interesting for me reading this book, Caleb, and I know you have I think you have more exposure to Christianity than I do, but I've spent all my life kind of learning about ancient Greek thought, understanding really deeply ethical schools of thought and ways of life from this exact time period. And so then looking at Jesus as a contemporary, as somebody who was going about and teaching, and in some of his apostles, they traveled to Athens and they preached to Stoics and Epicureans, and this really was a contemporary time period to what we talk about. And so really interested in that perspective and that kind of intersection. So people would have been learning about Stoicism, they would have been learning about Epicureanism, and then they would have been getting this exposure to Christianity. And so how do those match up? So that's the approach. Any thoughts from you?
Well, I think it's a great topic. It's a huge topic. There are so many different angles. We'll be taking, I think, the more philosophical, ethical one, as you said. But of course, perhaps we should have follow-up episodes about maybe more some of the metaphysical issues, Christianity as a critique of Stoicism and the reverse, because of course there are some metaphysical debates that of course we'll touch on, but perhaps not get too deep into the weeds. And of course there's the historical matter where there's an interaction between the Stoics, other Hellenistic schools, and Christianity in a sense wins. And there's, I think, an interesting discussion about why that came about and what that says about both Christianity and the Hellenistic schools. So, but I suppose we'll be focusing more on the ethical, philosophical aspects today. And I think there's a lot there. As Michael said, I should say that I grew up Christian, but I'm no longer a practicing Christian. So I'm of course a little bit more drawn to the Stoic picture of things, but I do think there's a number of Christian thinkers, and of course I do think it's a worthwhile thing for really any Western person to do is read the Bible along with some of the Greek classics.
Yeah, and then as a point of a caveat, I'm going to criticize or at least think critically about some of the things that Jesus says or teaches as I've interpreted them in the Gospel of Matthew. But in my, I don't mean any offense by that. And in my anecdotal experience, every practicing Christian I've met has really respected engaging with the thought seriously and taking it seriously and asking kind of deep questions. I just know that approach. If you're not used to kind of a philosophical lens, sometimes it can seem abrasive to kind of ask well, why is that the case? Or what's the justification for this position? Or, I think this position is contradictory. But I mean all that as a, as a candid exploration of it as a school of thought, as a way of thinking, as a way of life, and applying the same lens to it as I would to Stoic arguments or cynical arguments or skeptical arguments. Great. One thing I want to do by way of context is a shout out to Brittany Polat. And she's a former guest on the show. She's written a course for our Stoa app, and she has a new book coming out March 17th, 2026 called Jesus and Stoicism, The Parallel Sayings. This is not an endorsement, but it's not a paid endorsement. I haven't read the book yet, but I like Brittany's work. I'm sure it will be a thoughtful book, and anyone interested in this topic or wants to dig deeper, that's something for you to look into. So with that framework in place, like I said, I'll be looking at the Gospel of Matthew. So structurally, as I was mentioning, the New Testament opens with 4 Gospels. It's the retelling of Jesus' life by one of 4 apostles, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Structurally, there's a lot of overlap. And I was reading a bit about this, and on one hand, there should be a lot of overlap because it's the same. Jesus' life is the same, but there's slight variations to the story, slight differences in emphasis between each of them. And so that's an interesting fact in of itself. And so in the Gospel of Matthew, we start with Jesus' birth, his significance as a new prophet and as the Son of God. We go through Jesus' life, his teachings, and then it concludes with his death by crucifixion and then his ultimate resurrection. And so I want to focus on those teaching parts, the pieces that I thought were most interesting or stood out to me. There's 1 or 2 places where I'm going to call out where it's not from the Gospel of Matthew, but I'll call those out when they come up. Everything else is from there. And I'll go through a series of teachings and then a quote to back it up, and we'll parse those as we go. So to kick things off, one thing that I thought was really interesting is this idea of vice is in desire. It's in what you think or what you desire, not in the action itself. I'm used to the Epictetus where we talk about the chapters. So book 5, verses 27 and 28, Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart." And so this is this notion, presented with this as an ethical school of thought. He's presenting, one thing I thought was really interesting, he's explicitly presenting this as like an update to Moses. It's like, this is a previous prophet. Moses said a lot of good things, but people are misinterpreting what he taught, misunderstanding what he taught. And so you have this commandment, do not commit adultery. And I'm now placing this emphasis on your desire, your lust, your internal life. And so if you desire someone else's woman or someone else's wife, you've committed adultery in your heart. That's an interesting idea. It also makes me think of Stoicism. It makes me think about this idea of mistaken judgments as being the vice or the issue in Stoicism. Not, it doesn't matter whether you go out and you successfully are adulterous, because you could be turned down, you could be unsuccessful in your attempts at adultery. But what matters is that attention, that intention, that judgment, that desire in Stoicism. And I see the parallel here.
Yeah, and there's it's also connected to Stoicism because it's demanding. It's not just you don't just get off the hook because you didn't cheat on your wife. You can't even think about it, really, which is a much higher standard than any external behavior or external markings.
Yeah, that is a good point. It's a high level of You almost think of it, I think of it like a floor versus a ceiling. The floor is, you can't go out and commit adultery. Like that's the, that is the worst thing you could do. But you're not a great person. You haven't reached this ceiling either, unless you've succeeded in not, as you said, not even thinking about it, not even wanting it. It raises this idea. I mean, the Stoics talk about this a lot. It's just about success, right? Like, how should I phrase this? You think about people that aren't bad people just because they don't have the power to be that. It's like the ring of Gyges in Plato. Said, well, Plato's question is, what would you do if you had a ring that turned you invisible? And because it was ancient Greece, being invisible, there's no infrared cameras. If you were invisible, you could just do whatever you wanted, get away with anything. Um, and how many of us don't do things because we don't have the power to do them? What would we do if we had the power? If we had more power, would we change? So I take that your point as being the high standard. It's not just it's our internal life is maybe a better example of what we would do if we had the power. And then the external life is more about circumstance. It's more about the things outside your control. You don't succeed or you don't get away with it because of these external situations, but you still wanted to, or you still saw the appeal.
Yep. There's a amusing passage by the sort of cynical, satirical writer H.L. Mencken, where he's discussing sexual morality and, he's a satirical writer, but he essentially argues that men in his day didn't cheat on their spouses enough, not because they didn't want to cheat on their spouses, they did, but just because they were cowards, right? And didn't have the wherewithal to actually follow through on
right. Exactly. It's like
talking to another person. Right. Right. Yeah. Exactly. So it's not, you don't get any points for that sort of behavior.
Yeah. If you're if you're an adulterer who's a coward, you're not better than the adulterer who's not a coward. That person is better than you, because they only have one vice and you have two. But if you measure it by external, you seem like, oh, that person didn't cheat on his wife and that guy did. I like that point. That's a great point. And so another related teachings, and this is from Matthew, book 6, verse 1-4, is so virtue as well is in desire. It's not an action, Jesus tells us. So he says, be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others, to be seen by them. If you do, you'll have no reward from your Father in heaven. And he also says, so when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in their synagogues and on the streets, to be honored by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you. I've got there's a bit of a conceptual issue here with like, well, is it really for the right reasons if you're doing it for the reward of God? I'm sure there's some stronger theological arguments for this, but at the very least, Aristotle talks about doing the right thing for the right reason. And Jesus is really emphasizing that. You can't go out and help people because you want to look a certain way, because you want certain status, because you want people to think, wow, what a great person this is. If you do that, you'll have no reward from your Father in heaven, he says. When you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets. And you think about, in today's age, we have that idea of like, people on Instagram, they film, and you can have this consequentialist view. So they film, donating money or doing acts of charity. You have this consequentialist view of like, well, if somebody, if they are genuinely giving that person money and they're filming it, who cares? But then there seems to be this virtue ethic argument of there's something weird about that. There's something unsettling about somebody doing an act of charity and filming it. And I think that unsettling part is speaking to this idea that, our virtue is in our desire, not in our action. And I think one way of demonstrating that is if you're willing to do it. So if you're willing to do that without being seen, if you're willing to do that without a reward, I guess I'm not fully qualifying that virtue is just in the desire. There's maybe some degree of success. But it's certainly not in the action by itself. You have to do the action at least for the right reason, I would say.
Yeah, I think that's right. Perhaps action does matter, but it's not, it needn't be public. And there's there's this additional point about hypocrisy and being exceptionally wary of hypocrisy and Pharisaism, which Jesus is certainly concerned about. And it brings to mind, I forget this, don't have the citation off the top of my head, but it brings to mind that line from Marcus Aurelius where he talks about something to the effect of beware about behavior that requires curtains, which is sort of the reverse kind of point where beware of the tendency to want to do specific things in private, because perhaps that indicates that it's not such a good idea or a vice, where here it's sort of the reverse point. If you're, whether or not something should be public or not, don't do good things just because you get some public reward or public recognition.
Yeah, which the Stoics talk about too, right? I think a lot about Epictetus's quote all the time about if you want to show how, if you want to practice physical endurance, well, go for a hard run, take a sip of water and spit it out, just to like prove that you can survive without water while exercising. But please don't do it in front of anybody, and please don't tell anybody. And it's nice to see that same kind of theme coming up here in Jesus' teachings, that idea of that hypocrisy, that doing it for the right thing for the wrong reason is being insufficient. I think it's such a key idea in practice.
Yeah, well, I think both the Stoics and Christians want to say your behavior should be robust in different circumstances. And what makes it robust is your desires, your character, right? And so you don't want to be swayed by external rewards or punishments.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Another teaching I wanted to call out is turning the other cheek. So in Gospel of Matthew, book 5, verse 38 to 42, Jesus says, "You have heard it said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you." And this was funny for me. Maybe you knew this one, Caleb, but I always thought turn the other cheek was like, look away, or like, don't judge somebody when they do something bad. I never really understood. I never had heard the exact quote before, but this idea of someone slaps you, you turn your face and go, I'm messing up the audio quality because I'm turning my head side to side to demonstrate this, which no one can see. But when you go to someone slaps you, you literally turn your face and say, like, look, if you want to keep slapping me, here's the other side of my face. You can have another go. I think that's pretty badass. I think it's very cool. It's very kind of radical in an Epictetan way. It makes me think of, when Epictetus says, the dictator says, "I'll cut off your head." And he says, so, well, whoever said I wasn't to have my head cut off, right? Like if that's what you're going to do, that's what you're going to do. Well, you just spoke about this idea of robustness of character, and I haven't used that term before, but this idea of persistent character regardless of the circumstances. Mm-hmm. And this is an idea of that, of like, I'm going to be kind. If someone slaps me, I'm still going to be kind. Instead, most people live like you're going to be nice unless somebody disrespects you or unless you need to have self-defense. It's such a radical claim. And I think that's really cool when it challenges us, because how many people do this? Not many. Not many turn the other cheek if that's the understanding of it, which is this ultimate, it's really is like passivity in a way to external circumstance with a sharp focus on internal character and virtue, but not an attempt to intervene or control the external. What do you take by it?
Well, I think you're definitely right that it's related to these points about if you're kind, whether or not someone slaps you shouldn't change your kindness, shouldn't impact your character. And I think that's certainly correct. I think it's difficult. I think there's also an idea of a clear reading where you could have an anti-revenge reading to this passage. It's an argument against revenge entirely, which as Stoics would be aligned with. Perhaps even arguments for nonviolence, but there are other passages that cut against that. It's, of course, something that has been debated. But I think it's useful to think of Jesus as really radically overturning a number of different teachings, and this is a great example of that. And in particular, undermining this idea of an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, which is so common across ancient cultures, but modern cultures as well. And I think that's one of the key things I take away from that, and how I try to understand. Sounds somewhat reductive, but I suppose how I try to understand Jesus's project.
Yeah, well, and I mean, you're situating it. He's explicitly referring to a previous ethical norm and pushing it or challenging it with the reference to the eye for an eye. And then I also wonder historically if eye for an eye was relatively reasonable. Like maybe before eye for an eye, it was like, if you take my eye, I kill your entire family. And then the eye for the eye was then, well, it's like even, it's balance. It's proportional revenge. And then Jesus updates that with no revenge. You don't need anything. If somebody takes your eye, give them your other one. Yeah, I agree with the non-revenge piece is important. But some of these are they're not as explicitly revenge, right? If someone makes you go a mile, go with them too. If somebody asks something of you, give to them. It's kind of like bending yourself around the will of these other people instead of coming up against it or being this hard rock of resistance. Cooler than I took that passage to be, or that expression to be in isolation. Another one this is actually possibly my favorite. So this is about this idea of loving your enemies and loving your neighbors. So in book 5, verses 43 to 48, Jesus says, "You've heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect." And I loved that idea. This is probably the teaching that I still think about the most from what I read, is the idea of you've got to love your enemies, because if you love your friends, everybody loves their friends, right? You're not doing anything ethically impressive. You're not challenging yourself. You're not pushing yourself. Everybody's nice to the people they like and then mean to the people they don't like. You need to be nice to the people you don't like. It's almost like this. If I relate it to Stoicism, I would relate it to the intellectualism, which is that the Stoic argument that everybody pursues what is good and everybody rejects what is bad. And I just love this piece of, if you just go about pursuing what's good and avoiding what's bad, you're just doing the same thing as everybody else, the Stoics would say. You have to think carefully about what actually is good and actually is bad. And so for Jesus, it's like, if you just fall into being nice to the people you like and mean to everyone else, well, then you're not a good person. You can't stand behind I'm kind to my friends, I'm kind to my family. Everybody's kind to their friends and their family if they like them. It's a higher standard, to go back to that previous point. It's that higher standard. It's that updating of a previous lesson. And then one other quote here on this idea of loving your neighbors. In book 22, verse 37 to 39, he says, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself." And this idea of loving your neighbor as yourself really reminds me of Stoic cosmopolitanism. This appreciation for another person as an equal, and the love for another person as an equal. Yeah, so those were some nice passages about loving your neighbors. and being, loving your enemies too. What are your thoughts?
Well, I thought the way you put the first set of verses was very, very powerful. This idea of loving your enemies and your neighbors equally, and well put. The second verses we looked at, love your Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is love your neighbor as yourself. That does bring up the first commandment, of course, which gets into these questions about God, God's nature, which is of course a metaphysical matter, which I suppose you can't always dodge. I think at some point you need to reckon with these claims Christianity makes about the world, that there is a God, and that as such you ought to love him and align with God, align yourself with God in some way. And people make similar arguments about Stoicism, right? They'll say, the Stoics need to think about Stoic metaphysics and Stoic account of God and align yourself with the Stoic God, which of course is a very different character and shape than the Christian one. So I think that is always worth flagging, because sometimes one can almost interpret perhaps both Jesus or the Stoics as purely ethical teachers, when of course they had views about that extended beyond the ethical worldviews that were quite deep and substantive, that about issues one can't just skip over, of course.
Yeah, I'm kind of skipping them here, but
yeah, which we're going to do anyway, but it is worth flagging.
Yeah, we're kind of like skipping straight to the second commandment, and there's that whole big piece in front of it that he is explicitly saying is more important than the second piece. And it gets back to some of those arguments we were having about Stoicism about, do you need that theological piece? Do you need those arguments around God to ground the ethics? What do you lose when you lose the Stoic God from Stoic ethics? And Caleb, I was taking you to just be calling that out here, as we can talk about this. We can talk about these ethical lessons without reference to the metaphysical claims or the explicitly religious claims, but they're there and they're explicitly more important, if not grounding the ethical claims. Great. And so another teaching, I'm just kind of calling out my greatest hits here. Something else that he teaches about, this is from the book of John, but I wanted to call it out. It's a very famous anecdote, but one that I hadn't read before. There's a lot of value in going through the New Testament and just seeing all these really famous stories. Oh, that's actually where that comes from, because it gets retold so many times. So this is the casting the first stone story, and it's about forgiveness and hypocrisy. So a little bit of context is if I'm remembering correctly, a group of townspeople bring in a woman accused of adultery, and they bring her to Jesus and say, well, you should punish her if you're this great religious person and you have this great sense of ethics, right? Shouldn't you dole out the punishment to her? Shouldn't she, be will you either stone her or will you condone her stoning? And so they're asking him about this. And Jesus says, quote, but when they persisted in asking him, he straightened up and said to them, who is without sin among you? Let him be the first to throw a stone at her. And again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. When they heard it, they began to go out one by one, beginning with the older ones, and he was left alone, and the woman where she was, in the center of the court. Straightening up, Jesus said to her, woman, where are they? Does no one condemn you? She said, no one, Lord. And Jesus said, I do not condemn you either. Go now and sin no more. And so we were talking at the start of this episode, Caleb, about this like really high standard, right? About how there's this really high standard about judging yourself by your thoughts, not even by your actions. And one way to look at that is almost puritanical, right? Like we're all terrible. If we're being judged by the standard of desire, we're all failures, right? Like the Stoics say, we're all vicious, we're all idiots, except for the sage. But here you have this lesson, maybe of forgiveness, and if not forgiveness, at least of hypocrisy, and about how we need to be cautious not to condemn others. We need to be aware of our hypocrisy, and that's all Jesus is asking them to do, is apply a consistent standard to themselves, right? If we're stoning people that have sinned, well, let the person who hasn't sinned throw the first stone, and everybody kind of recognizes, oh, that's a good point. I couldn't pass that test, and they all left. But then at the end, you have Jesus, who's presumably without sin, I would assume, and he doesn't condemn her either. He doesn't throw a stone either. So he doesn't apply. It's not like he's saying perfect people stone people. He's the perfect person and he doesn't stone her. He doesn't condemn her even. There's something about that I find really, I don't know, almost emotionally moving about we can have this ethical project, but we don't have to be really judgmental. We don't have to be really judgmental of others. We don't even necessarily have to be judgmental of ourselves. And we shouldn't be hypocrites in terms of holding people to standards we don't hold ourselves to. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's almost as if there's you have this picture of demandingness that we get. It's an exceptionally difficult moral standard set by Jesus, but at the same time, there's acceptance, of course, love, the ability to meet people where they are at, while also holding to a high standard and being especially critical of hypocrites. So it's interesting. I think that's definitely interesting, an interesting almost paradox perhaps to wrestle with. The Stoics, I think, have it as well, right? There's this picture of the sage of perfection that you're always failing to meet up to, you're always failing to match. And that, there are real judgments associated with that. But at the same time, there's a focus on, there is, I think, a general wariness of judging others, and of course, an ability to set expectations with others and yourself that are realistic, and that's comes, I think, with some that that must come with some amount of patience.
Yeah, I like the way you put that about demandingness, but also, I don't know, acceptance. It's an interesting balance. It's one that I think I would benefit of personally, because the temptation there is to give up. If acceptance is to give up demandingness, and I love
Yeah.
myself for who I am, and there's nothing wrong with me, and so I don't need to try to improve. Everybody just needs to accept me as I am. So to balance both of those in your head simultaneously, it's not an easy challenge, but it's probably the correct disposition. You think of it like any other craft or skill, like an athlete, right? You have to hold yourself to a high standard, but if you break your tennis racket every time you mess up your serve, you're not going to get your reps in. And so that demandingness and acceptance, yeah, well put, and probably the right approach to go about the ethical project.
Yeah, I think it comes with some amount of emotional satisfaction, perhaps. This idea of, it's a little abstract. I'll see if I can try to explain this, but this idea that you can, you have this demanding aspiration, but there's some amount of acceptance, realism in terms of how well you or others will measure up to it. So I think there's some amount of solace that can come with that picture, while also maintaining serious motivation for excellence. But in a way, it's even more difficult. I was just thinking now, if you're trying to master some craft, maybe you have a gym and you're just collecting top performers, you're probably going to cut a lot of the weaker performers, and that's going to boost, in a way, perhaps, the performance of your gym as a whole. You'll get people training with each other or whatever who are at the same level. They don't need to, waste their time with weaker performers and so on. But in a way, I think the call is, perhaps the challenge from Jesus is to, no, you should do your best with everyone in a way. not any short. He didn't go and spend his time, of course, with the top moral performers, top theological performers. Of course, he spent his time with the downtrodden, social outcasts, and so on. So anyway, but I think there's something there about this project being
Yeah.
almost in a way even more difficult than sort of standard ways to pursue excellence might be described as.
Well, it's almost like an Epicurean picture, right? Maybe I'll contextualize that a bit. If we take the craft analogy to an extreme, it's like, what do people do? They go away to camp. They surround themselves with other experts in the craft. They go to school on the topic and they train with an expert teacher in kind of isolation. But the ethical project has this ironic point where it can't. So that's the traditional craft model. But then ethics, you can't be the best person. You don't want to be the best person at the school, at the academy. You want to be the best person surrounding yourself with normal people, engaging with normal people, engaging with challenging people. And so it's like you almost have to learn how to play tennis. It's not the best tennis in isolation. It's like you have to play great tennis with really bad people who can't even serve or something like this. And you have to learn how to play with that in those scenarios. And the craft analogy breaks down a little bit, but I'm trying to get this point that you're doing it with people who are terrible at it. And in handling those situations well, that's the demonstration of the skill. And that's kind of unique because in most other crafts, you become surrounded by other people who are really good at their craft. And that's the way you measure excellence. That's what I was taking from what you're saying. And I thought
that's well put. Yeah, go ahead. No, yeah, that's well put. That's that helps fleshes out what I was trying to get at. Just think about how Seneca advises you to choose friends carefully and so on. In a way, this almost cuts against that advice. It's maybe there's different points in a life where that advice is more applicable. But if you're aiming to choose friends because that's going to choose good people to be your friends because that's going to shape your character, that does say something about your character, perhaps be more malleable than it should be. Or, of course, the sage is able to be friends with anyone and remain the sage. I think that would be more sage-like, more Christ-like, what have you.
Last teaching I wanted to hit on is the danger of focusing on appearances. We've talked about this a little bit, these themes of hypocrisy. They're all over the place, and I love them. They're really great lessons. I think we should emphasize it more in modern society. We've kind of lost this. So this is Matthew, book 23, verses 2 through 8. And it goes, the teachers of religious law and the Pharisees are the official interpreters of the law of Moses. So practice and obey whatever they tell you, but don't follow their example, for they don't practice what they teach. They crush people with unbearable religious demands and never lift a finger to ease the burden. Everything they do is for show. On their arms, they wear extra wide prayer boxes with scripture verses inside, and they wear robes with extra long tassels, and they love to sit at the head of the table at banquets and in the seats of honor in the synagogues. They love to receive respectful greetings as they walk in the marketplaces and to be called rabbi. Don't let anyone call you rabbi, for you only have one teacher, and all of you are equal as brothers and sisters. I love it. It reminds me of Epictetus telling his students, the one student can interpret Chrysippus or read Chrysippus the best, and he's like, you're an idiot. I don't care how well you can interpret Chrysippus. I care about how you act. And so you have these people, these religious authorities walking around, and they have these lavish outfits, and they sit in these important positions of power at the heads of the table. But there's this vanity there, this pursuit of power there. Don't follow their examples is what Jesus is saying. And I love that. It's just always keep your eye on the prize, what you're really after. Something Stoicism teaches a lot. And I don't see how you could be engaged in any sort of ethical project and not encounter what Jesus is calling out here, which is people who are, confusing the rewards or the appearance or the accolades with the actual pursuit itself. And to recenter our attention on that is very, very important. And I'm glad to see Jesus call that out here.
Yeah, so much of the Gospels is Jesus just dunking on these Pharisees, really. That and driving out demons.
I love it. I'm here for it. So those were the teachings that stood out to me. We talked about the danger of focusing on appearances, forgiveness. We've kind of reframed that as like high demand, high acceptance. This idea of loving your enemies, because if you love your friends, you're just the same as everybody else. It doesn't make you special. Turning the other cheek, that anti-vengeance idea, but also this radical kind of kindness or openness to other people. And then this idea of this part of this high demand is being that vice and virtue is vice is in your desire, not in your action. If you're an adulterer and a coward, and so you never cheat, that doesn't make you a better person than someone who's just an adulterer. It's about your character. And then for virtue, there's this idea of, the right action has to have the right reason. If you help people to be seen or to appear a certain way, that's no good. You're not actually acting properly. And so with those in mind, I wanted to turn to points that didn't make sense to me or kind of stood out to me. I don't know if I want to call them criticisms, but just things that jump out to me as a Stoic. I go, this doesn't really make sense to me, or I don't find it philosophically coherent. So to jump into those, first one is just Jesus performs miracles, walking on water, turning water into wine, healing the sick. I just don't understand the ethical function of these. I don't understand what they prove, what the point is ethically. It goes against, to me, this idea of, maybe it is that idea that you have to do the right thing for the right reason, and that if you're doing it for the right reason, it's better to be more powerful. There is a kind of consequentialist piece if you have the ability to do it. I just don't care. For me, I have that Stoic idea of like, the sage who's a poor person with no power is just as great as the sage who's an emperor. So it's like, it doesn't really matter to me if Jesus has powers. Like that's not really compelling in any sense. That's piece number one. Obviously there's this kind of metaphysical piece of proving that he's divine, but yeah, it's not ethically interesting to me. I don't think it makes him better than other people. What do you think about that?
Well, that's certainly the Stoic view, so well captured.
Yeah, I don't know. Like, I think those lessons would be just as good if you couldn't turn water into wine or you couldn't heal the sick. It's cool that you can heal the sick, but I don't see the benefit to that ethically. Please do it if you can. The other part that stands out to me is that Jesus' teachings are based in faith. Like, there's a lot of, if you just believe, a lot of discussion around the ethical importance or the obligation of faith. So here's a quote, Matthew book 11, verses 22 to 24. Jesus says, "Have faith in God. Truly I tell you, if anyone says to this mountain, 'Go, throw yourself into the sea,' and does not doubt in their heart, but believes that what they say will happen, it will be done. Therefore I tell you, whatever you ask for in prayer, believe that you have received it and it will be yours." And so maybe this is where this idea of moving mountains comes from, but he's literally saying that you will move a mountain if you believe enough. Your lack of belief is the lack of movement the mountain does not move because of your lack of faith. And I don't understand the ethical function of faith. I don't understand judging people. There's a lot of passages in the New Testament where somebody says, "I believe you're the Son of God," or "I believe in you, Jesus, and your teachings," and then they're somehow rewarded. Their sickness is healed, or they're promised something. And for me, it's very kind of confusing to me from a Stoic background where you're supposed to have knowledge, which are these logical arguments in support of something. And the issue to not having knowledge is that, you don't understand the world as it is, but believing the right thing because of faith or because of a leap in logic is not any better. You have the right proposition, but you don't have the right reason for it. And so all these kinds of appeals to faith they don't. It really strikes a strange chord with me. I don't understand what to think about it. That's a big question, but what do you think about faith?
Well, it is a big question, but perhaps one way to make faith a little more appealing is to map it onto the idea of weak versus strong belief from Epictetus, which it's not so much believing something for no reason, but these people are surrounded by Jesus. They have beliefs about him being the Son of God, and faith is sort of a challenge to turn your weak belief into a strong belief. It should be a strong belief, but it's not because you are afraid of looking silly or you're afraid of taking a risk on what you know is true. Perhaps you can see this best with the Noah story in the Old Testament, where, of course, Noah is told to build an ark because a flood will come. And everyone thinks that's silly. There's a modern picture about, I forget what it's called. I think it's got with Jim Carrey in it. Is Jim Carrey in this movie? Where
Bruce Almighty.
Yeah, Bruce Almighty. Anyway.
This is the first Jim Carrey reference of the podcast. We are here.
Anyway, I think that's sort of what quintessential picture of faith, where you're told to do something by God, and it is reality, but you're sort of called to have a strong belief and act on it, even when you're going to be punished socially for doing so, or even when there are other parts of you that really don't want to acknowledge the truth because of what it would mean. So I think that's a kind of defense of faith.
Yeah. I think there's some language confusion, because I don't know that that's always what people mean by faith when they say it. But the way that I've been interpreting faith is this idea of believe this thing that you don't have evidence for. Not, some people do mean it that way, but you've presented this other picture, which is faith is act in accordance with what you know to be true. Don't deviate from something you have good reason to believe because of other desires or fears or, corruptions or temptations or something like this. That to me is compelling. I don't know if it's always used that way, but I like that idea. And I'm sure it's used in both ways.
Yeah, it's definitely not always used that way. And there are certainly arguments, both in terms of Christians through history using it in a different manner, but also certainly arguments against the picture of faith I just presented in terms of an interpretation of what Jesus is actually saying. But I think it is one reading that's at least up there.
Your interpretation also helps us make better sense of those parts in the passage. Like, I can't remember who talks to Noah, but is it God himself or an angel? And it's like there's these weird passages of like, why is this person having a crisis of faith when they have literally talked to an angel or they've literally got a message from God? And the crisis of faith becomes, I have to then follow through on that, or I have to act that out, as opposed to, do I actually believe it or not? Which is your interpretation, your framing makes more sense for those kinds of stories, definitely. Another piece that I struggle with as a Stoic is this promise of external rewards. So Matthew book 19, verse 28 to 29, it goes, Jesus said to them, truly I tell you, at the renewal of all things, when the Son of Man sits on his glorious throne, you who have followed me will also sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. And everyone who has left houses or brothers or sisters or father or mother or wife or children or fields for my sake will receive 100 times as much and will inherit eternal life. There's other passages, there's other parts of the top, I was talking about this idea of, do the right things for the right reason. And Jesus is saying, be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others or to be seen by them. If you do that, you'll have no reward from your Father in heaven. And, what is the right, so we talked about doing the right thing for the right reason. And what is the right reason? And if the right reason is getting your reward, the the right reason is pleasure, that doesn't seem like it can be the right reason. And if it is, doesn't that just make Christianity this kind of like hedonistic picture? Like you're just doing it because you're going to get what you want. You're going to satisfy your desires. It's just this delayed gratification. You have to be nice now so you can get 100 times what you gave up in heaven. And that could be the picture. Like like I was saying, the Epicureans have that argument that like the goal of life is pleasure, trying to maximize pleasure over your lifetime. And maybe you can kind of make that calculus or that wager. But it seems to me to be this total deviation from the kind of virtue ethic sense I had previously of Christian teachings. It's really hard for me to reconcile that. What are your thoughts?
No, I think you're right that it's hard to reconcile. It's easy, I think, a natural reading of Jesus as a figure is that he's a Jewish apocalyptic prophet, and that he's talking about the end times and they're coming soon, and that in a way that suggests that's another reason to be a good Christian. And that's just, it does cut against this picture of virtue as purely internal, because now there's an external fact. The kingdom of heaven is coming soon, that seems to, promise reward for good behavior or punishments for bad behavior. So I think there just is that tension. And there's a nice short story by Ted Chang called "Hell is the Absence of God" on this point, which I'd certainly recommend if you're interested in science fiction or exploring this idea more deeply. It's sort of explores this picture and of if you want to take the internal motivation to be Christian seriously all the way, what do you end up with? It's I won't give any spoilers or say too much else about it, but I certainly recommend it if you're interested in this theme.
Yeah, I'm a big Ted Chang fan. He wrote, for those, Caleb, seems like you read him as well, but for those that are listening, he wrote the story that inspired Arrival, the movie, which is also in the same book, Stories of Your Life and Others. That short story, Hell is the Absence of God, is in that one. And I think his short stories are amazing, so I would also recommend it. I can't actually remember that one, but maybe if I read it quickly, I have read it. But yeah, his books are great.
Nice. Yeah, we've never talked about that at all, but yeah, I'm a big Ted Chang fan as well.
Great. I mean, what I was taking from you there is just like, yeah, that's a problem. Like, I don't know what to do about that. Yeah. I mean, maybe we'll have to get a theologian on here or something and grill them with these questions. So, I mean, I'll wrap things up. In conclusion, I went over some of the things that stood out to me from reading the Gospel of Matthew. As you said, Caleb, earlier, I think everyone in the Western world or interested in Western culture should take the time to read at least one of the Gospels. It was really quick, enjoyable. And I think Christianity is just so culturally influential anywhere in the world that it's valuable. And then as an ancient philosopher, I just like going back to the primary sources. I think if you're interested in Stoicism, you should be reading Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, Seneca. You should be reading some of the classics. And so if you're interested in Christianity, just going right back to the source, for me, it was very intimidating. Kind of you think, wow, this is such a big topic. This is such a big book, but was an enjoyable read as well, because it's also written to be accessible, right? And written to communicate the idea as well. So I'd recommend it to anyone who hasn't. You get through it pretty quick, and it's been changed the way I think about the teachings of Jesus Christ as an ethical school. I'm not sure if it solved any of the kind of religious questions for me or theological questions for me. And I'm not sure if it was like, if there was much compelling argument, at least in the Gospels, to believe, if you didn't believe or don't have faith. But as an ethical system, you get a really clear presentation, clear and compelling presentation there.
Awesome. Yep. Well done.
Cool. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Michael. Peace.